Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome for a second time a very respected professor from the world of academia, talking to us for the second time from Paris, France, Professor Jens Meyer. Jens, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ash.
Professor Meyer is a professor and lecturer, a program director and designer. He's an adjunct professor at INSEAD in France, and he has been a member of the team that formulated the Blue Ocean Strategy. And today we're going to speak about the Blue Ocean Strategy. So, Jens, before we start, going into a few more questions about Blue Ocean Strategy, for my viewers and listeners, can you help us understand the core concept of Blue Ocean Strategies and what inspired its development?
Core concept. What was the problem to be addressed? In the 70s, 80s, 90s, the high time of competitive strategy, we focused so much on an analytic capacity to compete. And somewhat we forgot to renew, to refresh, to regenerate, which if you look into the overall economic data, particularly in the Western world, led to a lack of growth in the sense that economically Wall Street still recognized growth, but overall we started losing pace, and it became much more a challenge of am I the better one, rather than addressing new and emerging problems. So this was the backdrop. When Chan and Rennie started their work, they realized in order to have a complete strategy picture, we have to have something which we call fortification. So the existence, how do we deal with products and services and offers in the market which exist? How do we compete as long as they're valuable? But how do we, looking forward, also regenerate, create new offerings, starting life cycles, which then would allow us to have a sustainable organization for the future. Right. So far it had been left to random events creativity. What Chan and Rennie set out was to systemize the process of how to regenerate from a corporate perspective a portfolio of offerings. So this was the premise, and it took them some time. It started with value innovation, disconnecting the concept of innovation from technology or these types of things, and saying, wait a moment, if we want to create something new, we have to create a new value proposition, which is distinctive. Right. And if you think of the pillars of Blue Ocean, the first one is very much, we're not trying to compete. And this doesn't mean that competition is bad. Both is required. We have to defend the existing, but we also have to care for the future.
Right.
So Blue Oceans is the frame which allows us to look into the future. This is the framework. So somebody who's trying to use Blue Ocean strategy in order to improve his or her product at this kind of stage, it's a nice exercise. It's not going to harm, but it's a lot of time and money invested in order. So, but if you're in need to renew your corporate portfolio, and then this is where Blue Ocean kicks in, it allows you to focus on the future, on something which is beyond the competitive frame currently. And from time to time, people have heard this notion or this idea of it makes competition irrelevant. It's not a statement of arrogance. It is that we have to make the effort to step out into a space which is uncontested.
Right.
And this is the second part. The anchor of the uncontested is what we call a non-customer. And the concept which was not necessarily new in the hands of Chan and Rennie, who were the authors of the book. An uncontested space or a non-customer, it had been mentioned by Schumpeter, it had been mentioned by Peter Drucker, it had already been mentioned by Edward de Bono. So again and again it was there. So you have to look at somebody who has a need which is not fulfilled. Can you actually surface demand, desires, needs, which currently have not been addressed? So this is the second part. The first part is, no, I'm not looking for a competitive product. The anchor, my guide, my scout in the market is the non-customer. And what has to emerge is the third pillar, that out from the eyes of the non-customer, whatever you emerge as a proposition, as a value proposal, has to add more value than you, even if you would kind of construct it yourself, would cost you. So in comparison, whatever you get from the existing supply side is not of the same value as what you can provide at the space and is perceived much lower cost. So just in repetition, blue ocean, and this is one of the biggest challenges for companies, it's not defending your past. It is exploring the future. The anchor, the guide, the scout are so-called non-customers, people whose demand has not been explored or has been ignored. And the third part is the economic evaluation. What emerges at the end has to be distinctively of a higher value proposition for this population than what has been seen before.
What a great response. Thank you. And for my viewers and listeners, can you talk about any interesting example of an organization that has successfully implemented a blue ocean strategy?
How much time do we have?
Yes.
No, the challenge, so the book has been written in hindsight with many cases. And these were cases which helped Chan and Rennie and the team around them to understand the dynamics of blue ocean. But in reality, you find many examples, B2B, B2C. One of the most popular was the Nintendo Wii. At the moment when Nintendo was actually exiting that space, being desperate in the competition between Microsoft and Sony, and them moving down the road, creating something which broke the rules, rather than having better graphics, rather than kind of competing for the 17, 18-year-old testosterone-loaded boy sitting whole days in front of a computer screen. It was looking at girls. It was looking at how families could be brought together in front of the screen. It was looking at elderly people. So this, Michael Olinek was one of the people part of the project with Nintendo, building it by understanding that the competitive picture which emerged between Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony those days would not allow to build a leap of value. But on the other hand, huge populations which were completely disconnected from the video gaming space, and hence reducing the graphics, making them less threatening, rather than making them more real, introducing very simple games like bowling or tennis, but at a level that you don't have to learn the rules. You didn't have to go into Dragon and Dungeon games, allowed this. But this is one of the examples. If you think of a company like Akzo Nobel, they were facing the competition of Teflon non-stick. And by shifting from trying to compete in the pan, as we called it those days, shifting to where are other needs of non-stick. And it was the white goods, which required easy cleaning. It was not the non-stick as such, but it was the easy cleaning aspect, which allowed Akzo to move and actually cater to a completely different customer. These were the white goods manufacturers. Another very exciting case, which I'm still love, kind of years and years and years ago, Johnson & Johnson approached us, kind of being concerned with the overall health and political situation emerging from that in Africa around tuberculosis. And what became known afterwards for a while is the TB, or not to be, tuberculosis, and the revelation that we could serve the space much better if we would change the dynamics in the labs. The labs was a fascinating place, but we realized there were too many false diagnoses happening in the labs. Picture the situation. You're kind of a day worker somewhere in the countryside. You start coughing. Somebody says, Ash, you should see a doctor. What you heard around these diagnoses are rarely perfect. You have to kind of stop working. You take a bus, you go to a clinic. You're not the best treated customer in the clinic. You queue, your spit sample gets analyzed by wonderful people who try to do hard work looking into a Microsoft in whatever temperature. And yeah, 30% of the diagnoses were wrong. But by understanding what this happened and how we could bring another dynamic. This is how it emerged and became so famous that we actually could identify a rat which could do the job. So we could change the brand of tuberculosis analysis and diagnosis and address the situation, which then helped to address some of the AIDS problems. So there are many cases, and I can go on and on and on for
no, but I want to move on. But thank you. These 3 examples are outstanding. But my next question, Jens, is what role does technology play in developing and implementing a blue ocean strategy?
In 2 ways. Technology today allows us to reach out in different ways to the non-customer. So I'm talking about the creation of a strategic move, a blue ocean move. To fully appreciate, if competitive strategy is building on existing data and information and is an analytical process to define a position which is the most promising. Blue ocean goes back because it has to generate new data. We don't have non-customer data. We don't have non-customer experiences, which means we go back into the field and understanding pain points which are there in the customer experience, in the way he or she exploits B2C or B2B, the outcome. So technology helps us today to spread, to kind of work together with the colleague Jason Hunter. We're experimenting kind of even in remote locations, people with cameras. So rather than you going into a situation where you go into Cape Town and look at the non-customer space or a customer experience, in the ramp up, in the exploration, technology makes many things much easier. And also during the pandemic, we didn't stop running Blue Ocean projects. So technology has become an enabler to reduce some of the costs and create from time to time efficiencies and pull in also other people into the conversation, which was harder before. And if we look at the outcome, technology is not as important. It can be there might be cases where certainly technology allows you to build bridges, which we weren't able to do before. But technology is rarely the driver of a blue ocean scenario. We went through in the 90s, end of the 90s, you have some examples. This is kind of when Silicon Valley started becoming big. Yes, we realized with the emergence of the internet, you could address needs which we hadn't considered before. But if we look to the DNA, it is the need, and the technology became an enabler at this point of time, but it was not something which was essential to the need which was addressed. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Great. Makes a lot of sense. And, you spoke about technology being an enabler. My next question is, how important is organizational culture? Because, blue ocean strategy means moving the ship into a different direction. And an organization or its people can't say, I want status quo or status quo ante. So how important is culture?
Enormously. It's the biggest killer. Every time you want to change something and the culture stands against it.
Yeah.
Peter Drucker's word, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Yeah. So culture is a very important piece. But interestingly, as deeper you go into the organization, as more open, welcoming people. So let me give you a case. If you have been a CEO, you've created your own chain of pharmacies, you've been in many senior positions. If you're challenged with an uncommon sense, something which does not fit into the mental model which you have of the world, it's a real challenge. Yeah. Because you have the burden of being responsible for hundreds, thousands or more people, enormous budgets, and you kind of worry about it. If you go deeper into the organization and you realize your product is not selling anymore, your customer has 5, 10, 15 different alternatives out there at the same price point, at the same features. If then somebody says, let's try something, let's explore new things, typically deeper in the organization, people are much more willing to engage in such a process and such a logic. So what we're recommending very often is don't try from the top to change the culture. Give the freedom, starting N-3, N-4, to tinker around and play around. And hence, you very rarely, in the successful blue ocean cases, you rarely see that it's perfectly run as the book has been written. people make their own soup, but this is what it should be.
Yeah.
So culture is an enormous piece. If it is dictated from the top, it is a very heavy exercise. I had the beauty to work with some companies where the CEOs, those days with Pfizer, Jeff Kindler, or Ronald Foss from Starwood, and those people, they had been able to create a culture those days in companies which allowed to do those.
Right.
But very often, I understand the risk a senior person might perceive when he or she is confronted with a blue ocean logic. By the way, we often do not recommend to talk about blue ocean. We explain the tools, we explain the concept, and if, for example, you with your collaborators, you start saying, come, look, guys, let's look a little bit at the customers, and let's this time not to try to defend our product, but let's try to understand what problems we create on their side. And if you do these blue ocean steps, less branded, much more playful, your collaborators would very much appreciate and see how an open conversation allows to actually see things which we haven't seen before. So your point, culture is one of the biggest challenges, if not well managed. Hence our recommendation, don't bring it to the forefront of your corporate culture. Bring it to a level that it becomes a playful game of those stakeholders who should actually own the move afterwards.
Very well said. And how would a blue ocean strategy be aligned with an organization's sustainability goals?
Oh, any blue ocean project produces 5, 6, 7 results. It's when we start from a coordinate, which we call the red ocean, it's typically what we start from a product or product category. This is the point X, is our point of departure. Now, the problem for many people, we don't know where we're going to end up. We cannot forecast. We don't know what are the pain points we're going to find. The pain points reveal the non-customer. Once we have the non-customers, we understand what their needs are in more detail. So we don't know 100% where it goes. So the challenge for us is to make sure that at the end, we pick those scenarios, those moves which are most relevant in the context in which you're playing. And I promise you, you will always end up with a scenario which will be probably very harmful for everybody. You might make money, but will not be very good. And you might have scenarios which might be fantastic for the world and very sustainable, but very far of your core competencies of the talent which you have. So by the end of the day, when you have the portfolio of scenarios emerging, moves emerging, you have to pick the ones which we talk about today has to fulfill 3 requirements. Economically, it has to be relevant. It has to be able to produce an energy or a culture which is of benefit for the organization, and it has to serve the world. So this is how we would say the final decision has been made, but it can only be made at the end. This is one of the challenges. We don't know where we end up. So halfway, we're going to get a smell. But in the beginning, we don't know. And if somebody says, Jens, only produce this, look, guys, come back in 2 or 3 months, and then we know better.
Well said. The other thing that I've been speaking to many people, and they say that blue ocean strategy is for large, established companies. I want to get your perspective on how does the small and medium scale sector develop or apply a blue ocean strategy effectively?
As long as you're not a single product company and you have all your eggs in the same basket, then it's possible. So yeah, there's always the requirement to have the slack to invest time of your people in an extracurricular activity. So, well, to make it tangible, we consider the most successful formula we found is like 20 people, 4 teams of 5. So manageable small teams over 3 to 4 months. This means they invest 1 day, 1.5 day per week on such a project. You can do the math. This is what we've discovered so far as the most successful formula. For a small and medium-sized company, this is definitely of a higher budget or relative budget than for a corporation. But I have friends who kind of, Jens, what are you doing? You're known for this blue ocean. And then I have a wonderful friend who is now one of the biggest tire distributors in France. And out of the conversations, he created something which is called Tribu Pneu, the tire tribe. It's a B2B model of distribution where he helped the little petrol stations, you know, these who have these 10 tires next to it, but could never serve all the clientele around, not in time. So out of this, the non-customer became for him these tire distributors, the very small ones, and created a back office setup that anybody in France can in 24 hours deliver. And so, and his company is not big, so we're talking about 200 people or 250 people. Rehability, one of the most famous blue ocean cases, a friend of mine starting a store, he was handicapped, he was sitting in the wheelchair, and he started this mobile aid business, and realizing that he ended up in this gray area of being in city center, gray locations, cramped windows, not attractive stores, nobody wanted to be in there. And in the conversation, through the conversation, what emerged that the non-customers are actually the loving caretakers who don't want their kids or their partner to be served out in that space. And what he created was the most fascinating, most energizing rehabilitation space. So he moved from the city center into the countryside. The logic was simple. If somebody tries a wheelchair or a walking aid, there has to be space, not 10 meters of carpet. If a father wants to do something for his handicapped child, it has to be a colorful, a funny wheelchair. There has to be activities. They created sports clubs, musical companies. And so he created a whole universe which created mental mobility in the mind of handicapped people, much more than the physical, but it served and eventually became one of the biggest suppliers for the Paralympics.
Wow.
So, yeah, definitely budget-wise for a big company, this is much easier, but it applies at any level. And no, sure, and there are some entrepreneurs. We have people who come out of our schools and who've been in these classes and start applying it and develop successful business cases. But yeah, the relative costs are higher if you're small.
Well said. So I have time for two more questions for you. My next question is, while there are a lot of positives associated with blue ocean strategy, what are some of the risks associated, and how can these risks be mitigated?
One of the biggest risks is the political risk inside the company. Not every new scenario will succeed. Whilst in a competitive space, I can always build risk management that's for the individual strategy. I can't do for blue ocean. So blue ocean is, as a single move, is not as valuable as an overall construct to renew. Right? Like in the private equity world.
Yeah.
Think it like this. Out of 10, you have 1 or 2 high flyers, you have 5, 6 sidewalkers. They make their money, but they never become big, and you have 2 or 3 where you say, kind of, nice idea, but it actually didn't work. The same applies to blue ocean strategy. If your personal career is attached in the culture of a corporation where everything has to work, and I had somebody last week who says, kind of, look, in our culture, it says we succeed the first time. In such a culture, the biggest challenge is for your political career inside the company. Beyond that, economically, people had tried to prove that there is an economic risk. No, it turns out if you get into the swing, take a company like Samsung or the who use Blue Ocean or Toyota as a regular part of their strategy making portfolio, over time you succeed. The probability that you succeed is much higher than if you do not engage in the regeneration or recreation of your portfolio.
Well said. And Jens, my last question to you, and you've been associated with the blue ocean strategy from the time it was formulated, and clearly you are an expert in this area. If I was to ask you to look at your crystal ball and tell me, where do you see blue ocean strategy a few years from now? How do you see it evolving, given all the technological inputs of artificial intelligence, generative AI, and whatever else is coming in?
Very interesting question. Together with a colleague, Michael Olinek and Peter Semsky, we started developing an AI engine for strategy. It is not published yet, but we have tested it and piloted in different areas. One of the reasons going down to the Middle East was also kind of to do this with the bank. And everything which is competitive, hence based on existing information and data, which can be resolved through analytic means. Yeah, I would say the classic strategy consultant business. There is a serious danger in front of us. On the other hand, if we look at data which is not available yet, hence which requires exploration, then what we find that even the hallucination of a ChatGPT or something like this can add to the thinking process. It will not give you the solution. In the competitive sense, to make it simple, the probability that the machine can give you a competitive strategy is very high and is already very impressive what we can produce. If, on the other hand, we look for the renewal, then it is more the machine becomes a coach to the strategist. So I think the pressure will be more and more on companies to focus on the renewal of their portfolio. So I believe blue ocean strategy will gain in prominence, but and to be very fair, we still have to learn how in detail this collaboration between the machine and the strategist trying to renew will have to be coordinated, managed.
Well said. What a great response. And on that note, Jens, thank you so much for speaking to me about Blue Ocean strategy. I think I learned many new things from you about Blue Ocean strategy. I'm sure my viewers and listeners will listen to every word that you have said about Blue Ocean. I love the 3 examples that you gave, and as you mentioned, how much time do we have? I wish I had far more time to just keep talking and learning from you on Blue Ocean strategy. But thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you, Ash. See you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.